this ain't real. Why in the world would I give my heart to you? Just to watch you throw it in the trash. I've been juggling so long, I don't think I can hold on. Where were you when I needed you the most? Now I'm sitting here with a black hole in my chest. A heartless, broken mess.
Hello, everybody. Hi, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be hosting today's Tin House at Home as part of the 2020 Tin House online workshops. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our program, we're on the second and final week of the conference with over 200 writers meeting together for workshops, readings, craft lectures, and to build community. You can find a full list of public events for the rest of the week at tinhouse.com/workshops or by following the hashtag THWW. And you can support our guests and our faculty by buying books through the link that I'm going to post in the chat right now. And for anyone watching on YouTube, all those links that I just listed are in the bio below. So I'm so thrilled to be here for the Vocation of Poetry, a panel with Oliver Baez Bendorf, Franny Choi, Anis Mojgani, moderated by Eloisa Amesqua, and joined by interpreters Mac and Rory. A reminder that there'll be a Q&A at the end, so if you want to type your questions throughout the talk in the Q&A box, there'll be a little bit of time for that. Eloisa Amesqua is the author of the collection From the Inside Quietly, the inaugural winner of the Shelter Belt Poetry Prize selected by Ada Limon, 3 chapbooks, and her second collection, Fighting is Like a Wife, is forthcoming from Coffee House Press. Eloisa is a visiting faculty member for the Randolph College Low Residency MFA program, the founding editor-in-chief of The Shallow Ends, a journal of poetry, associate poetry editor at the Honeysuckle Press, and of course the founder of the incredible Costura Creative, which is described on the website as a Latinx-owned and operated talent agency representing contemporary poets and writers for speaking engagements, readings, workshops, multidisciplinary collaborations, and more. Eloisa, it's wonderful to have you back in the mix with us today, and I'll go ahead and let you take it from here and introduce the rest of our panelists.
Thank you so much, India, and thank you, India and Lance, for all the behind the scenes work and probably in front of the camera work that you've been doing throughout the past 2 weeks. It is very much appreciated. Hi attendees, it's so great to be here. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we're going to get going on a conversation. And like India said, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box just so we have those all in one place. And they're easy to get at the end of this. Okay, so Oliver Baez Bendorf is a queer trans Latinx writer and educator. He is the author most recently of Advantages of Being Evergreen from the CSU Poetry Center, winner of the CSU Poetry Center Open Book Poetry Competition, which Gabrielle Calvo-Caresi, who's like one of my Trinity poets, called an essential book for our time and for all time. His chapbook, The Gospel According to X, won the Rain Arroyo Chapbook Prize. He's received fellowships from Canto Mundo, Lambda Literary, Vermont Studio Center, and the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing. He's born and raised in Iowa. He has an MFA in poetry and an MA in library and information studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he's assistant poetry professor of poetry at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. Next up is the wonderful Franny Choi, a queer Korean-American poet, playwright, teacher, organizer, and all of the things. She is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Soft Science and Floating Brilliant Gone, as well as the chapbook Death by Sex Machine, which is maybe one of my favorite chapbooks ever. She's received awards from the Poetry Foundation and the Helen Zell Writers Program and fellowships from Vermont Studio Center, Rhode Island State Council of the Arts. A Kundiman Fellow and graduate of the Vona Workshop, she founded the Brew and Forge Book Fair, which is a fundraising project that brings together poetry readers and writers to aid social justice community organizations. She's a member of the Dark Noise Collective and a winner of the Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship. She's currently the Gaius Bolin Fellow in English at Williams College. And last, but certainly not least, Anis Mojgani, who is the current Poet Laureate of Oregon, which is just like incredible. He's a two-time individual champion of the National Poetry Slam and winner of the International World Cup Poetry Slam. He's also had residencies at the Vermont Studio Center, Air Serenbe, the Southwester and Oregon Literary Arts Writers in the Schools program. He's the author of 5 books of poetry and has done commissioned work for the Getty Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, and he has a few TED Talks, which I think you can see online. Anis has also been on HBO and PR. His poems have been featured in the Academy of American Poets Poem the Day series, as well as numerous journals. He's originally from New Orleans and obviously currently lives in Oregon. That'd be weird if you were Poet Laureate and you didn't live there. I guess crazier things have happened. So I want to start by asking a question to all 3 of our panelists today on, do you consider poetry and or being a poet your career? And I guess part of that question is, how do you define career for yourself?
I feel like I should jump in because I was honestly looking up the definition of career about 15 minutes ago. I was looking at like, okay, vocation, career, like just kind of trying to find a way into these things and like whether they are interchangeable. And it turns out that career in the 16th century referred to a wagon or a chariot. And then it was like the gallop of a horse. And then it just became more generally about like how you travel, like how you stay in continuous motion. And so I don't know if that adds anything here at all, but I was surprised, I think, to find that the definition didn't mention anything about money, which I was kind of excited about. And it, I think it makes me feel less ambivalent about like claiming poet, you know? And for me, I try to always lead with poet before, you know, professor or anything else in my sort of descriptors, because it's the one that feels like that it kind of holds all of the other ones. And that it feels like the one that, because it isn't attached to like anyone else giving me that job title or that job offer or anything, that it's just mine. Like I feel closer to that labor. So yeah.
I really loved hearing that the thing that carries one in motion, you know, that is really, really lovely. And I mean, and so I don't know, like with regards to it being a career and it being a vocation, you know, like for me, it's yes to both of those. Being a poet, writing poems, sharing poems to people is how, just like in a very like direct manner, that's how I've made my living for the last 15 years. And there's definitely like other things that pop up, but it's largely just by being a poet. And so in a very cut and dry manner, it's my career, it's my profession. But I also love that idea of that principle of it being a vocation, it being something that one is both carrying and is also like being carried by. And that money is not a thing that's like involved with that it's more just sort of a study, a practice, a discipline. And, you know, in that regards, it has been as well. So, yeah.
Franny, thank you for rejoining us. I hope your power is okay. do you consider poetry your career? And or like, what does career mean to you?
It's a really interesting question. And yes, sorry everyone, there's a thunderstorm, and so hopefully our power won't stay out for too long. Do I consider poetry my career? You know, I think I consider it like my work. I think that I've tried, generally speaking, to structure my life in such a way that it would be, you know, as close to the center as possible, that poetry would be as close to the center of my life as possible. And so I think in my case, yeah, I would say that yes, I mean, you know, because like what that looked like for me and for my case has been, you know, to invest a lot of my time in the kind of like work of publishing and having a job that has something to do with poetry, etc. But I think that even if even though it is currently my career, if it turned out to be the case that, wow, it's really coming down. If it turned out to be the case that like what was best for me to continue, like the best way for me to continue to put poetry at the center of my life was to get a job in like the nonprofit sector, having something nothing to do with poetry, then it would still, you know, even if that career shift happened, like the, you know, what was on like my W-2 changed, like poetry would still be the work that I was here to do. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's a kind of a tricky question. Yeah.
And this question is for all of you. Do you think it is possible, and if so, how can someone create a sustainable life for themselves? And by sustainable, I mean both like emotionally and financially and you know, the practical ways inside of the literary world ecosystem, and perhaps more specifically inside the poetry one. I think the three of you have very different routes in sort of centering poetry in your world. And so if you could talk a little bit about like I guess the deliberate choices you've made to make that possible.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in here. I've been thinking a lot recently about my relationship to institutions, particularly like moneyed, powerful institutions that are like, that are kind of like pillars of like the arts and culture like world, right? And I think that for me, part of the answer to how to build a sustainable life as a poet has meant like recognizing that there are ways in which that is like where a lot of the funding and support for artists comes from, you know? And the same goes for, in a lot of like other realms of lives that I've lived, like in organizing. A lot of like the nonprofits through which I was doing organizing work were dependent upon foundation grants in order to fund the like very radical work that they were doing. And so I think that like for me, being able to build a life that feels like in line with my values and also enables me to do the work that I want to do has meant like looking at my relationships with institutions and like before going into them, really being like clarifying for myself what it is I'm getting out of that relationship, you know? So so that like it's very easy, I think, to fall into the trap of just being like, I've gotten a fellowship at this place, or I'm in an MFA program. That's great. Like, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be looking for this power or this validation or whatever. Like, if I can clarify that I'm not getting an MFA because I think that I should have one, but because I want legitimacy within the academic job market, time to write, and one or two classes that really grow my craft, then if at any point my relationship with the institution stops serving me in those ways, then I can feel free to leave. You know what I mean? So like, whereas I think that if I had gotten into this trap of like, I just need an MFA, then I would be like afraid to leave, and it becomes like a more parasitic relationship. So this is like a very long-winded answer, but I think that clarification for me has been super helpful.
Definitely. Anise or Oliver?
I'll jump in. Yeah, for me, because you know, like I didn't come to I didn't start doing poetry with from a place of kind of like thinking that I was setting out to be a poet, setting out to study poetry. Like I I went to school to do comic book illustration, and so it was like, you know, with that, there was like a conversation that I had to have with myself when I was like 19, 20 years old. That was essentially like, Anise, are you all right making art, probably under the umbrella that this will not be your vocation. This will not be your career. You will more than likely be working a shitty job the rest of your life. And if you're fine with that while having time enough to make art, then continue on this path. And I don't know if at 43 I would answer a thumbs up to that same question as I did when I was 20. But that was the conversation, you know, and I was like, yeah, of course, you know. And so, you know, my path was always focused on what my personal relationship was and is to my craft. When poetry revealed itself as something that I was very interested in, and when poetry as a spoken form presented itself as something I was very interested in, when I was done with school, that was the direction that garnered my focus. It was you know, like I left Savannah, Georgia, where I was living, to go to New York solely because there was a large spoken word and poetry slam community there. And it allowed me to be around other people that were doing the things that I loved doing, and gave me a community in which I was able to feasibly grow and learn, and center my focus and my relationship to what my personal artistic discipline was. And that has always been, for me at least, like largely the compass for all the things after. You know, it wasn't necessarily like a lot of let me do this so that I can do this so that I can do this. Instead, it was like, well, I really love writing poems and I really love performing poems, and I will do that. And if opportunities arise that allow me to, say, spend more of my day doing that and more of my day until there's less things taking up that space and that time that's pulling me away from it, I'll follow those opportunities. And you know, so for me, a big part is just kind of like centering whatever it is that my personal relationship is to the work, and what does that give me. And the other things, not that they're irrelevant by any means, you know, but like whether I'm working in poems, whether I'm working in art, whether I'm doing something that has nothing to do with either of those, if my relationship to my art, if my relationship to my craft is open, like there's an open dialogue between me and it. And I say open dialogue isn't because, like, you know, one also has to, I think, remain open to the possibility of how those things change. That it's not like, all right, I'm a poet, so I'm going to be writing poems until I'm dead. You know, like I the last 7 months, I've barely written any poetry. You know, that's just like how it is. And so as long as I'm able to maintain an open and honest dialogue with myself about my relationship to my craft, then the other aspects of like, is this work or is this no longer work? As in like work for sustenance, work for income. Then those things will fall into place for me, at least.
I think the way that I'm thinking about this idea of the sustainability, it's kind of on two levels. And I think, I mean, yes, Franny, to what you were saying as well about sort of like reflecting on, you know, your relationship with institutions. Yes, Anise, to what you're saying about kind of centering your own personal relationship with your writing. And, you know, on the personal level, I think for me, like the setting up, you know, a sustainable trajectory, this wagon of the career, like I have learned that it isn't something that just happens once. Like every change, there's sort of a new set of anxieties and that it has to instead be this sort of like constant process of renewal. And so what do I need for that? Shelter, food, clothing, right? Time. Also, I think time has become increasingly more valuable to me, and just in how I sort of prioritize things and make decisions. And because it's like the one thing that there's not, you know, more of. But on the other level, like, to, you know, thinking about the poetry ecosystem of like how we relate to each other and to our environment in a sustainable way. And to me, that means that I also have to be thinking about it's not enough to sort of be satisfied with like achieving, you know, conditions for like individual economic survival, but also like I want like Medicare for all, and I want student loan cancellation, and not forgiveness. We should stop talking about it that way, because it's not like a sin that needs to be forgiven, just canceled. And I want, you know, universal childcare, so that like the whole poetry ecosystem that I'm part of is sustainable. And I know that I will write poems always, but thinking about like being, you know, in relationship with other poets, like those are things that to me feel exciting in terms of you know, changing the landscape and being able to, you know, be part of like a more imaginative ecosystem, or just where we get to devote our resources to that. And because I know like there's so much creativity and imagination that gets directed toward just economic survival, or toward having to figure out how to, you know, set up these ways of just being able to like keep the lights on, and keep writing, and like what could happen if we can all like, you know, just know that those things would be taken care of, and like get to, you know, focus on the work. So
totally, Oliver, I love that. I mean, I think that like thinking of it as an ecosystem is super helpful. Like I feel like I've like said in like a few other conversations recently, I've like said like industry or whatever, which is like, it is an industry, but also I think, you know, ecosystem also makes me think of like remembering that like the things that the sustenance that we get from that ecosystem are more than also just like, you know, money and food and shelter and things, but also I don't know, I think like remembering the things about being part of a community of poets that like feed me and like grow my soul are also, and like remembering to connect back to that at every step of the way has been really, really vital.
Yeah, I think where there's often like you know, I don't think it's like controversial to say there's not much money in poetry, specifically in publishing poetry, right? Like that's not a new idea or a new thought.
What?
I don't know, maybe Franny's sitting on like millions of poetry dollars. But you know, I don't think industry is the right word for what a lot of us are working towards. Perhaps it is maybe what we are working within, but it's not what we like imagine for ourselves. And I think a big part of that, personally for me, has been like making choices towards where, and perhaps more specifically where like unpaid labor in poetry is put. And sometimes that is personal, like applying for things is what, like, I consider that unpaid labor, right? Like you're doing something for yourself that is work. that, you know, maybe an application takes like 3 hours to do. And at the end of that is like a 2% chance that you'll get some sort of return on it, right? But there are other forms of unpaid labor, being a reader for a journal, setting up fundraisers, you know, the Brew and Forge book fair that Franny runs every year is part of that ecosystem, right? That's unpaid. But I'd love to talk about, you know, the ways to make money in poetry are sometimes publishing, like getting an advance, publishing poems in paid venues, grants and fellowships and awards. But what unpaid labor in poetry do you think that you've like put in time and energy and effort that has been worth it to you? Like, I think perhaps maybe more worth it than some of the paid labor that you've done. If you could speak to that. Who's going first? Okay.
I think I can. When you said what unpaid labor has been worth it, the first thing that came to my mind is reading. And it feels strange to call that labor, but it's just something that I know like feeds me in a way and is important, and that I like almost never regret spending time on, and in fact should do even more of. And I also, I think there is a lot of money in poetry, and that it is concentrated at the top. And so I think for the vast majority of people, there's not a lot of money in poetry. Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, you know, so many poets, I think, are sort of running like a one-person small business, right? And so when you were talking too about these sort of these aspects of it that aren't like directly getting paid, but that just sort of like are necessary to make it run. I feel like I've learned a lot from doing those things. I try to think sometimes about the time that I put into an application and the likelihood that it will get accepted as just, I mean, often that's helping me, as agonizing as it can be, to try to write about what I'm working on right then. It's a helpful exercise to do. And so I try to kind of think about these things in different ways like that. But yeah, I think reading books has been super valuable, as well as some like kind of mentorship, informal mentorship with you know, with poets in my communities.
Yeah, so there was a period of time where maybe like a few years where most of my income was from teaching with Project Voice, which was an organization that was started by Sarah Kay, and that Phil Kay, Sarah and Phil are the co-directors of that organization. And they, most of my money came from essentially teaching poetry workshops and doing performances at schools that were primarily like wealthy K through 12 schools, private schools. And that work was like, you know, it fed me in a lot of ways, but it was also like very, like pretty distant from the work that I really wanted to be doing in some ways as well. Like I felt, yeah, there were days when I was like, wow, so amazing that I'm like getting paid a few $1,000s to like teach these. These aren't the kids that I want to be like hanging out with and spending lots of time, you know, you know, growing the skills of. And so what happened during those years was that I was like basically what happened was I used the funding from those schools, the money that I made from teaching at fancy K through 12 schools, in order to fund all of my other work. So I would like spend 1 week a month teaching kids wearing like striped ties, and then for like the other 3 weeks I spent like maybe like 30 hours a week or something, running the Providence Poetry Slam and like rebuilding the youth program, which had kind of fallen apart, and organizing in Providence where I lived. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that for me, it didn't exactly feel like it was like unpaid labor. It's just that I had come up with my own kind of operational budget for my work, you know, like this work was funding me to do that work. And so it was paid in that sense. So yeah, but like that was the work that was like, you know, like the community building in like people, you know, among people that I felt like a sense of mutual accountability with, and that I saw myself in like deep relationship with. Like that was the work that I wanted to do. And so I was like, I'll just do it however I can like afford to do it, you know. Yeah.
Kind of similarly to what Franny was saying, you know, a friend a spell ago was, I can't remember exactly what they had said, but it was something along the lines of that, you know, when one is getting paid for, you know, primarily I'd say like in the arts, you know, like when one is getting paid, very often, you know, the way to look at it is that you're not necessarily being paid for this very specific thing that you're doing, but you're being paid for like all the hours that led up to that, you know, and you know, because like, you know, I think in the arts, there's sometimes such a lopsidedness to like what a paycheck is versus like what you're doing, you know, like technically my work is, you know, like when I get a paycheck, it's for an hour of work that like allows me to pay X amount of months of rent. But then I'm like not doing quote unquote anything for months and months on end, you know? And so it's like, there's a very strange disconnect there. But the reality is that like, I'm not getting paid for that 1 hour that say like, I'm sharing poems with people. I'm also getting paid for the 6 hours that it took me to travel there. I'm also getting paid for the 48 hours that I'm away from my life at home in this other city. And I'm also being paid for the 4, 5, 6 months prior to that, in which I'm simply like engaging with myself, engaging with my art, engaging with my craft, and also engaging with all the anxiety that comes with like, you know, staring at open wounds and wondering like, how am I supposed to pay rent when I'm not doing anything except sitting in a coffee shop, you know? So it's like, so even within, you know, this aspect of like the labor that I'm doing that's not being paid, that labor is being paid at some point. And, you know, so, and sometimes I get kind of torn by that, I would say, you know, because there is an element where, you know, I don't want to have my creative engagement, my community engagement, the things that I do and that like I would be doing regardless of whether or not they are connected to my rent. Like, I don't want to qualify them by, oh, this is worth doing money, so I need to do that. You know, so it's like this weird game of being able to like, you know, honor that work as work, while also like honoring it as something that I'm going to be doing regardless. That like, you know, that it exists as both, you know, income-based work and just like work that we're all tasked to do as humans, regardless of like whatever that labor might be, you know, whether it's like capitalistic labor, whether it's just simply like, you know, the labor that we're doing to provide for our well-being, our spirit, as well as the spirit and the well-being of the community that we surround ourselves with. So that's the place that I usually find myself like, which one is it while it's both at the same time?
That's really beautiful. Okay, I'll do one last question, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, because I imagine folks might have questions themselves. What is one thing a writer, poet can do today or this week or this month that you think could be of benefit to the poetic ecosystem? And it can be a large thing, it can be a very small thing, but like, what is like an actionable task, I think, and maybe specifically towards the poetic ecosystem that like you personally envision for all of us.
I'll jump in. That's I like this question just because it also like it requires me to have to answer that for myself. You know, it's like, all right, what are you going to task yourself with, Anise? You know, and I think, and I also just love that idea, you know, that has sprung up out of this, that poetic ecosystem, you know, because it is something that, you know, I think the task of the poet is so very often this super solitary endeavor, but like it also cannot exist purely as that. Like there has to be that relationship and connection to others. And so, you know, I don't know, when I think of that aspect of it, the thing that I would task oneself with is like, you know, I'd say like two things. One, how is one introducing and sharing other people's work that's not one's own to other people, whether that is like other poets and writers, or whether it's folks that like do not have a usual continual relationship with poetry, you know, who are not even necessarily like the writers, but like just like what are the poems that we are putting into the hands of people that need them, particularly right now. And the other thing is like, what are the ways that we, you know, tasking ourselves to like engage with poetic acts that aren't necessarily, remembering that the poetic acts that we engage in are not always, do not always result in like writing. You know, I try to hold that really present and at the forefront of my day-to-day, that, you know, when I take a walk after dinner at dusk, like what that does for me just as a person and how that then rolls off into my work, it can't be described. You know, I you know, I can't like have a checklist. All right, I did this part of my writing routine. You know, like there's something that it's doing for me as a person, and so as a result of that, it's going to do something for my poems. And so, you know, finding the ways that we are tasking ourselves with doing things that are just like connected to living and allowing that to like wash up in that ebb and flow of like how it will affect our poetry. Even if we're like, I'm not doing this to like write a poem, I'm just doing this to kind of like, you know, get some of this muck off of my heart a little bit, and that will have a result.
I love all of that, and I love this question too. And you know, when I think about the ecosystem that I want, like how do I want to relate to other poets, right? And also to like our physical environment or environments. I keep, you know, I think it is ongoing challenge to like dream of ways of relating to each other that are not in competition. And I think that can be challenging to just do as individuals, given like just that like we are all like trying to, you know, make it with these like few you know, opportunities, so to speak, in our field. But I think that it can also be really powerful just to try to dream of like, or like sit with that question of like, what other ways are there that we can, and perhaps already are relating to each other, that like question that, right? And so when I think about that, I think about thanking someone, right, for a poem of theirs that I came across that week. Or I think about just on my own, you know, like reflecting on what I'm grateful for, or, you know, getting to know something about like what's going on in my backyard or outside that I don't know about. And I think also that it sometimes feels, to speak frankly, I think sometimes it feels easier for me to remember that, you know, meritocracy is really like a myth when good things aren't happening to me, right? That I can like brush off not getting something that I wanted by like remembering all the things that have to happen first before, you know, someone can even make it to that application or whatever. And that is harder for me to remember that when like I get something or, you know, I win something or have a publication. And so I'm trying to just like be curious about that and shift that also. So if you would like to just join me in that this week by being aware of that, I think that can, that could open something up, no, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. This is such a good question, Elisa. And I think I feel, I mean, like RT, everything, all of the above. But also, you know, I think that maybe a thing that is on my heart right now is like thinking about the particular communities, arts communities that have nourished and fed me, you know, whether that's, you know, the 5 friends of mine in the Dark Noise Collective or the Poetry Slam scene of Providence or Kundiman or, you know, like the kids that used to hang out in the basement in undergrad to like read poems to each other and like thinking and like just trying to ask like what do people who are in those spaces now or equivalent spaces like what can I do to like return some of the nourishment that I've gotten from them, whether that's like money, which sometimes it just is, or like uplifting, you know, people in it or in that space, or just like texting, I don't know, like texting Charlotte and being like, how's stuff and like what do y'all need, you know, what should we, you know, whatever, or just like how are you you know, so that's on my heart. I think also another thing that's on my heart is just like I think that maybe it's good for every part of the poetry ecosystem if every poet like looks at their own work and like makes the conscious decision to like love it, like love the art that they make, like no matter what else happens. And you know, I think I've learned a lot. Hi Charlotte, I love you. I think like the lesson from, oh, the power's back on, great. The lesson from Slam that that like just like the scores that you get will depend on like the random motherfuckers that are in the room that day, and that doesn't, and like you have to like cultivate your own loving relationship with your work and not depend on what those 5 people think. Like I think that the work of that cultivation is I mean it's a lifelong thing, but I think it starts with a conscious decision to just say like, hey poems, I love you, you know.
I love that. Thank you so much. And I think it's really important. Then we're often as poets like, oh, we're supposed to be really, I don't know, like meek and humble about our work. But like, I think it's okay to be, not only to love your work, but to be very proud of it, right? Like you made a thing, that's incredible. And all of the, like Anise said, like all of those walks you took and making food for yourself and like taking a shower all went into making that thing, which is great. Not many people can say that about the work they do. Okay, so we're going to take some questions from the Q&A. So if you have a question, please put in the Q&A box. The first one. First of all, thank you so much for your nourishing, heartening conversation. I'm constantly thinking about the relationship between our work, our community, our institutions, and capitalism. And lately, I found a lot to learn in the ideology of collectivism. And my work has been bending toward that in turn. While not shaming or ostracizing those who write from more individualistic perspectives, is there a way for these disparate sort of places to meet and strive for the same goal?
I'll jump in, and like one of the things that I think is really interesting, and you know, like from a broad stroke, like just that, like you know, so much in our society, like continues to force us to think in binary, you know, that it's either this or it's this. And, you know, I find that the reality is that it's largely this very large gray spectrum, you know? But like, and so that being said, like, I totally think that those things are able to exist all the time together. And it's been my experience that the more that I am writing personally from a place of talking about personal things for me, the more likely that my work is going to connect with other people. Just like the more personal that I encounter another poem, the more I am going to be affected by it. Like there's something about how the personal speaks to a larger swath of people. And that like whenever I've written poems that have sought to speak for a multitude of voices, for a multitude of reasons, the less real it becomes, the less sincere it becomes. And that's not to say that one can't write a poem that like speaks to many voices and for many voices from a sincere place. But that just that from my experience, like the more that I concentrate on what is important to me to like give to another person, the more likelihood that I'm going to connect with them and that I'm going to be speaking to something that is a larger collective feeling. So that's just my take on it. That like, you know, if you follow the thing in you that like wants to be shared, that thing is going to like find its home in many, many more people than we sometimes realize.
Yeah, I think that for, you know, the speaking to collectivism and like what it means to embody like a collectivist sort of like philosophy with the way that you approach your work, I think that like a lot of lessons for me have been learned through conversations with the Dark Noise Collective. You know, it was a conscious decision that we made to first of all be really intentional about the ways that we loved and supported each other, and to put that love at the heart of everything we did, but also just to you know, we made a decision to try to live in a way where we saw each of our successes as a success for everybody in that group. And so, I mean, it's like such a simple fucking thing, right? But you know, speaking to back to the conversations about like competitiveness, like it's something that's like weirdly kind of that like you have to like do it intentionally, or otherwise you'll be swept up in the like, you know, the way that things are. So like that, and then also just being like, you know, one person's success is everyone's success. One person's resources are everybody else's resources. You know, like to the people that you are, you know, that you decide that you'll be accountable, mutually accountable to. Yeah, I think that that there's a lot to like with those kind of two principles in mind. There's a lot of ways that can be like extrapolated out. But yeah.
Yeah, and we have 2 questions in the Q&A about specifically competition. So maybe we address those kind of together and get to some of the stuff that's already been described. The first question is, I have a sense that poets are a group of people who are never in competition with one another, who don't get bogged down in comparison. I'm sure this is not true, but it is my fantasy and I wish to have for my own writing life. How do you deal with insecurity in Poetland?
Oh, first, hi, Jen. Good to see you here, sort of. I wish that was the case. I wish that fantasy land was not fantasy. It is one of the things that I feel I'm constantly trying to better myself at. You know, and to be gentle with myself. That like, you know, I think that it's hard not to be shaped by this American culture to view things around us as being competitive, as like, oh, if that person gets that slice of the pie, then like I'm going to get a smaller slice, or like, hey, where's my pie? You know, they got a slice, where's mine? You know, and I can't stand it when that thing surfaces in me, particularly since it's like, you know, inevitably like happening to like poets whose work I love, whose poems I love, whose poets that I love. And of course it's like, I want so many more people to get to experience their work, you know? And so I don't know, the thing that I always try to like come back to is like, you know, recentering it towards myself in regards to, you know, what is somebody else's like light does not diminish anything that I'm working towards. You know, like I am allowed to honor and be joyous and be excited, you know, that a person is, say, being recognized for the wonderful work that they're doing. And even if like some sort of like light is also being shown on somebody that I'm like, hell man, this person is like fucking mad whack, you know, like like why is this work in existence, you know? And usually like less because of like the work and more because of like whatever problematic aspect of the individual that's making it. But at the same time, it's also one of those things to remind myself like that has no bearing on anything that I'm doing, like good or bad, you know, like both like the joys and like the griefs of, you know, another person's quote unquote career, another person's path has nothing to do with the work that I'm engaging in. And so just like continuously trying to recenter that. And so to allow for the space for other things to be happening that have nothing to do with me.
I think yes to all of that. And also, you know, I think I would add, like, we know at this point from the studies that like using social media exacerbates feelings of comparison. Like I've seen that enough in news articles at this point, to where I'm at a point where like I continue to spend way too much time on Facebook. And so I just have to like do that knowing my own risk that I'm exacerbating, you know, those kinds of feelings. And also going along with that, right, with social media, like, or, you know, with prize announcements or, you know, publications, things like this, that really, like, aside from my close friends, like, I know nothing about what anyone else's life is like. And like, I know as well for myself that like, that just because, you know, something major has been announced, like, doesn't mean that like, things are okay, you know? And so I try to just kind of hold that as well, the disconnect there can be. And really like, I used to just kind of try to take, you know, feeling competitive as information that like, to like focus back on my own stuff, or that it was, you know, a kind of a flag to me that like, maybe I knew that I was like neglecting some of my own work. And I think that's generative still a little bit for thinking about it that way. And also, like, it doesn't mean that there's anything, you know, wrong with you if you're feeling, you know, that competition or that competitiveness or insecurity, because there's really no reason that like poetry exists on its own in a bubble outside of just like the sea of competitiveness that like, you know, we like live in currently. So I think also like there's nothing, it's not helpful to like feel that way and then also feel bad about feeling that way. So try to just, yeah, breathe through it, and tomorrow's a new day.
The only thing I'll add to all of that is that I've recently taken a lot of encouragement from reading. I mean, like one always takes encouragement from reading Toni Morrison, but there was like an introduction to an edition of Sula that I was reading that mentioned that The Bluest Eye, the first run was like 1,500 copies or something, was the first run of The Bluest Eye. And she was like, oh, only those 1,500 people will read it or whatever, you know? And so like, you know, it's just kind of like a reminder that like, we don't know what like the lives that our work will live throughout the course of our lifetimes, and then also, you know, afterward. But then also there was a quote in that intro where she said, she was talking about all of the challenges and all of the ways that the institutions of like, you know, like the publishing industry wasn't paying her any mind. And the line that she said was like, my only option was fidelity to my own sensibility. And yeah, I've just been holding that close to me.
Thank you, Franny. could you type, wait, are you on your phone? Or could you, oh, someone else already did. Okay, I was gonna say, type out that quote, the Toni Morrison quote in the chat, so we could all write that down on a Post-it note and tape it to our foreheads. So on a more like practical, or I guess like material level, Fargo has a question. I appreciate this talk, especially Oliver's thoughts around working, dreaming against competition. Given that the forces which currently provide some poets with money to eat are necessarily invested in competition, what are material direct ways that poets can work to create and sustain alternative ways of distributing money? And I'll add resources to that, because it is very much financial, but I think it's also like other resources.
One that's super concrete, nuts and bolts, and I'll just bracket over here also, like, to be advocating for Medicare for all and universal childcare and does these things. I'll just pin that to kind of all of my answers. But super practical one here is you know, to pass opportunities or invitations on to other people. And in doing that, I think it's super flattering to get an invitation, right? And I think sometimes that gets mistaken for like, I can only sort of fully experience that honor or that invitation if I say yes to it, even if sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that. And so I have been trying to practice like fully feeling into like, that's awesome, that invitation. And also like, I can still, you know, feel good about that, but it doesn't, but like, I don't have to gather it to me if it's like not the right fit. Or even if it was, but like, I don't need that this month, right? And so that's something that's been on my mind of just trying to sort of, and that also holds me accountable to staying alert to, you know, people in my communities whose work I really want to like stand behind and lift up, and also challenging myself on that, right? And even trying to just be kind of less precious with that. So that's one that comes to my mind.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of like I think I sit on like kind of in between like two ends of the work of kind of redistributing resources, which is one like finding those doors that I have access to and like trying to hold them open for as long as I can. You know, like that scene in like in the Disney Robin Hood where like they go under the princess thing and like cut a hole and so that all the gold comes out and you just like hold it as long as you can hold it, you know? So this job that I have at Williams College, which is like, you know, really great and has been paying my bills. But one of the things that I've wanted to do is to try to use my little bit of time there, which is like 2 years, to like create a reading series where I can like try to use that reading series in order to pay not just poets, but organizers like as much money as possible. Be like, oh, come and give like a talk and we'll give you $2,000 because that's the standard honorarium. And so I think just hope, you know, yeah, just trying to liberate as many resources as you can have access to. And then on the other end of that is like building up what, you know, where that money is going, right? Or where those resources are going. And so I think that that there's like a lot of like grassroots kind of like spaces that are really amazing and doing incredible work, such as like, you know, like the Watering Hole is one that I've like had like the opportunity to like spend a little bit of time in, and like the work that's happening there is really, really beautiful. But also I think that it takes kind of like sitting down with a group of people that you trust and like reimagining, like trying to just like collectively reimagine alternatives to the way that things are running. So like, not just another literary journal or not just another writing retreat, but like, I think like the Brew and Forge Book Fair is an example of something that I was just sort of like, what's like a new way of doing it? Like, how can we kind of just like redesign the way that things work in order to have raise as much money as possible for like, in as collective a way as possible in like a shortish amount of time. Yeah, I don't know. I think that the thing is that like in this time of kind of like unprecedented economic precarity in some ways, maybe unprecedented is not exactly the right word. I think it just means that we kind of need like unprecedented ingenuity in order to like come up with the ways that we as people are going to survive, so new stuff.
Yeah, just real quick, like, yeah, I echo both those aspects, of what are the ways that, if ever there's opportunities that are coming to me that just like aren't a fit, for whatever reason, to not feel that like, all right, well, it's my job to just hoard them, if ever it pops up that like, oh, this is good for me, like, share whatever resources that one has with other people. And also like how Franny was saying, that like if everyone has just like access to loot, like how are the ways in which we are like putting that loot into other people's hands? It's like very often we have funds, we have resources that people are like giving to us to disseminate to wherever, and how are we like putting that into the hands of other folks? But I also think like that, what are the ways in which that like, I can say like, do specific work that doesn't give me something, but that like gives something to other folks with regards to whether that is like donated work, donated time, that is going to result in opening a door, that is going to result in somebody getting a check of something. What are the ways that like all of us have access to our own skill set, our own talents, our own platforms that are then going to allow for like money to be redistributed in other, like essentially like, building the bridges between like those who have like money in their wallets and those who may not. How are we like being able to like guide those two people to being in the same room? Because like so very often, like the people with the money in their wallets, like I have this money, I have these resources, I just don't know where to put it, like where does it go? And so trying to find the ways in which like one can be a bridge between like, here's the people that you can give it to, it's right here, there you go, so also like finding the ways to kind of like build those bridges, I think is really, really important.
If anyone is sitting on a pot of money, come talk to me. I'd love to chat with you. I unfortunately am not. Okay, so we have two more questions and we'll try to like rapid fire, alphabetical order. So Oliver, Franny, Anise, answer these. Just first thing that comes to mind. How do you define success for yourself as artists and poets? When do you feel the most successful?
What I think of is when I went on the job market and got a tenure track job offer. And I think about how like that, that unicorn, that like what felt like a lottery ticket, also like just the process of being on the market for me was really hard on my relationships, and like I think realizing how quickly it switched over from the stress of like, am I going to get a job, to like, how do I like, what do I need to start doing now to like make sure that I can get tenure in 6 years, and realizing that like there was always going to be a next thing, and that I couldn't wait like 6 more years to feel like I had time to like show up for my relationship. And so that helped. That is has had me thinking differently about success and like things feeling right, you know, with the people that are in my life and the people that I, you know, want to be kind of held accountable to and with. So yeah, so it's changed. That's a short version.
Forgot the order. Am I next?
You're
Who's
next.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, how do I define success for myself? I think it's just like when somebody who I really wanted the poem to reach like says something, you know, in either into the internet or like to me directly saying like this poem was really important to me or this book was really important to me. And then also like I think I just like think about it every morning that I like get to sit down to the breakfast table with my love and like eat our fancy granola and like just like have like a life where we're like relatively healthy. Like yeah, I don't know, I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, similar to Franny, that aspect of you know, in creating something and setting it off into the world and not, you know, it being sort of like, I don't know, you're 18-year-old kid, you're like, all right, the world is yours, off on your adventure. Maybe send a postcard or call home at some point and learning of the ways in which perhaps it has done something and how whatever it has done feasibly like gets brought back to you by someone else is forever a beautiful gift from this work. But I also think about like I've been thinking a lot of, you know, like with just everything that's surrounding us right now. You know, lately the thing that has been aiding me is like I think there's like a list of Woody Guthrie's like New Year's resolutions that started floating around some years ago, and one of the things on the list is like wake up and fight. And you know, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And you know, if I'm getting up and participating with myself, and so by an extension, my art, then that's a success. And you know, reminding myself like to hold both like the process close and also like the completion, and where like those two things like maybe sometimes are more important or less important than the other, but like trying to honor both those in those right situations. You know, am I like completing the work that I'm setting out to do if it's work that is supposed to be completed? But am I also like honoring the process, you know, of what it means to like travel with this work and through this work, because those are the things that are revealing things to myself. And so it's like when I'm engaging with one or both of those as much as I can, then that's a definite success for me.
I love that. Okay, last question, and I'll answer it too. Favorite literary magazine, favorite poetry podcast, if you have one, and any other source you'd recommend outside of Lit Magazine anthologies. So my current favorite literary magazine, I think, is the Mississippi Review. I think Adam Clay is doing a really incredible job with the poetry there, and it's really fun. And I just love the work that's being published there right now. Podcast Versus with Franny, Choi, and Dennis. If you have not listened to the latest episode with Cameron Awkward Rich, I was like crying for an hour straight. Listen to it, and not in like a bad way. It's just like the sweetest thing ever. And source of poetry outside of those things, the Ars Poetica series that Paige Lewis has been doing is really beautiful. You can find those videos on YouTube at, I think if you just look up Ars, OURS Poetica. So Oliver.
Okay, let's see. Literary magazines. There's so many that I think are doing such great things right now. I would mention an Acentos Review and Foglifter as two that I've been watching and enjoying for a while. As far as other sources, zines, YouTube, and these days, you know, staring out my window, and quite a bit of that. as a different kind of source of poetry. But
Yeah, I don't know. Favorite literary magazines. I think that Waxwing is great. And I like whatever I find like pretty much always at Boat. Especially because like, yeah, it's like cool to see, especially folks that are like sometimes like more like emerging and things. And yeah, Versus is cool. You guys should listen to Versus. But you know what's like almost like a podcast that's like almost a poetry podcast, but isn't a poetry podcast is the Memory Palace. I mean, it's not a poetry podcast at all, actually. It's 0%. But it's like kind of like historical, like very lyrical historical fiction. And so I've been listening to a lot of that. Yeah.
I'm like the worst because I just am never reading anything these days. But I always really, really love, like whenever I get reminded to like get a copy or to read it online, I really like The Sun. Yeah, something about it. Just I think that like the things that I've read in it have always just really been, I don't know, really lovely and really resonating. And also I a friend of mine, the poet Annalise Gelman, they and like a creative partner of theirs, they invented this new literary journal this last year called Mitts that I think is really, really incredible. And essentially you write in it as if it's like a word processing application, but it charts and catalogs every single change that you've made on the page, every erase, every like cut and paste. And then at the bottom, you then have the option to play this like video scroll essentially. And it kind of like unfolds in real time and you can go back through all the different drafts. And so the literary journal itself publishes those online. So, you know, you see the finished poem, but then you can also see the many different drafts that feasibly went into making this, and, you know, and just kind of pulls back both like the reveal of the process, which I think is so magical and so beautiful, but also, you know, throws forth a gauntlet to, I think, writers, like what are the new ways in which that you can create work that is feasibly ephemeral, you know, for a reader, that like only if you read the poem at this like, you know, certain juncture do you get this certain line, this certain image, and then it's gone. And so I think there's also a really beautiful creative aspect that one could explore with it as well. And again, that's called Mitts, M-I-D.
You dropped the link for it?
Yes, I will dig it up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then a podcast and another thing.
Oh, I don't listen to any podcasts. Like, it's not like a willing choice. It's just sort of like, whenever I put on my headphones, I just put on music. So it's like, I always forget like, oh, there's a podcast out there. But the like 2 episodes of Verses that I've listened to that were Angel and I think it was Hanif, like we're both like wonderful, you know? So yeah, more Verses.
Also Carl Phillips cooking on his Instagram stories is my favorite source of poetry.
He sings and dances, and it's just like incredible. If you can catch it live, it's so good. Okay, so that's all the questions. Thank you, panelists, for chatting. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, India and Lance, and the interpreters, Mac and Rory.
Yes, and thank you, Louisa.
Thank you so much.
Conversation, and thanks for all your thoughtful answers and amazing recommendations at the end too. Eloisa, thanks for being such an incredible moderator, and thank you to Rory and Mac, our interpreters. Thank you to everyone, all our participants, for your incredible questions as always, and for everybody tuning in on YouTube. And I hope that you all have a wonderful and restful afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.